2 jobs at 68? That's not inspiring, Margaret. It's embarrassing. Ashley said it lightly, the way people do when they want cruelty to pass for humor, and the room answered with polite laughter that wasn't quite polite enough. I was standing near the kitchen island, still wearing my supermarket name tag because I had come straight from my evening shift, my sensible shoes aching against the hardwood floor of my son's house. I looked down at the small paper plate in my hands, at the slice of store-bought cheesecake I had picked up on my way over, and I smiled as if I hadn't heard her correctly. Daniel didn't look at me. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored shirt, the one I had once ironed for him when he was interviewing for his first job out of college, and he cleared his throat as though the silence were the most uncomfortable thing in the room. I stirred the sweet tea in my glass long after the sugar had dissolved, listening to the soft clink of ice against glass, letting the sound anchor me. 68. 2 jobs. Early mornings stocking shelves from 5 a.m. to 11, evenings bookkeeping for a small auto repair shop 3 nights a week. It sounded exhausting when other people said it out loud, as if I were clinging to something I should have let go of. What they didn't see was the quiet order in my days, the satisfaction of numbers lining up perfectly in neat columns, the calm that came from earning every dollar myself. After my husband passed 5 years ago, everyone assumed I would slow down, maybe sell the house, maybe move into a condo closer to Daniel and Ashley. They used words like simplify and comfortable, as if comfort were something handed down like a blanket. I chose something different. I chose independence. At the dining table, Ashley's friends, 2 couples from their country club, sipped white wine and glanced at me with the kind of curiosity reserved for outdated antiques. You know you don't have to do that, one of them said kindly. Your son's doing very well. I nodded. I know, I said softly. And that was true. Daniel's consulting business had grown quickly in the beginning. New clients, bigger contracts, photos on social media from conferences in San Diego and New York. Ashley loved to post pictures of their vacations. In Napa, her hand wrapped around a stemmed glass, Daniel smiling beside her like success had always been his natural habitat. They assumed my double shifts meant I was struggling. That I couldn't make ends meet on Social Security and what little my husband had left behind. They didn't know about the small brick duplex I bought 12 years ago when property prices dipped and everyone else was afraid. They didn't know about the steady dividends from the utility stocks my husband and I had started investing in when we were still clipping coupons and splitting one steak between us at diners off Route 9. They didn't know about the quiet discipline of decades. Ashley leaned back against the marble counter and crossed her arms. I just think at some point, she said, her tone smooth, you have to accept your season in life. Season. As if I were autumn leaves waiting to be swept away. I met her eyes then, not with anger, not with defiance, just with calm. I said. That's why I work. Daniel finally glanced at me, something flickering across his face, uncertainty, maybe even guilt, but it vanished quickly, replaced by a tight smile. Mom's always been stubborn, he said, and the table laughed again. I finished my tea, set the empty glass in the sink, and slipped on my coat. My back ached, and my hands smelled faintly of cardboard and printer ink, but my steps were steady as I walked to my car. The night air was cool, carrying the distant hum of traffic from the highway. I sat behind the steering wheel for a moment before turning the key, letting the quiet settle around me. In the glove compartment was a folded statement from my brokerage account, updated that morning. I didn't need to look at it. I already knew the numbers. I started the engine and drove home to the small, paid-off house that still held my husband's old leather chair by the window. They thought I worked 2 jobs because I had to. They had no idea I was building something they couldn't even imagine. The next morning I woke before my alarm, the habit of early shifts woven so deeply into me that even on my day off my eyes opened at 4:30. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the kitchen clock and the low hum of the refrigerator. I wrapped my robe tighter around my shoulders and padded across the cool tile floor, passing the framed photograph of my husband on the hallway table. He was smiling in that picture, taken the summer before his heart gave out, his arm around my waist in our backyard while the old maple tree cast dappled shadows across the grass. I paused for a moment, touching the edge of the frame with my fingertips. He had always said, "Margaret, never let anyone make you feel small for working hard." I brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, the screen casting a pale glow in the dim room. I logged into my brokerage account, not because I doubted the numbers but because I liked the quiet ritual of checking them myself. The duplex rent had been deposited overnight. The dividend payments from 3 different utility companies were scheduled for the end of the month. The balance line sat steady and calm, growing in small, disciplined increments that no one else ever saw. I did not feel triumph when I looked at it. I felt peace. By 7:30 I was dressed in jeans and a simple cardigan, ready to run errands before my evening bookkeeping shift. At the grocery store I caught my reflection in the freezer door, hair pulled back neatly, face lined but steady. I looked like exactly what they thought I was, a woman past her prime clinging to a paycheck. The cashier, a young woman with bright pink nails, smiled at me. "Long day ahead?" she asked. "Not too long," I replied. "Just enough." Around noon my phone buzzed. It was Daniel. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice carrying a tightness I had learned to recognize. "Are you busy?" I glanced at the small notebook where I tracked my expenses and income by hand, even though the software did it automatically. Old habits were hard to break. "I have time," I said. He hesitated. "Ashley and I were thinking about coming by tonight. We wanted to talk." There was something in the way he said talk that made the air shift slightly in my chest. "Of course," I answered. "You are always welcome." After we hung up, I closed the laptop and folded my hands on the table. In the past year I had watched subtle changes in them. Fewer vacation photos. Fewer dinners out. Daniel's voice more strained when he mentioned new contracts. Ashley posting motivational quotes about resilience instead of pictures from wine tastings. I did not ask questions. I listened. That evening, after I finished balancing the auto shop's accounts, I drove home beneath a sky streaked with pale orange. My porch light flickered on automatically as I pulled into the driveway. Their car was already there. Daniel stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets, rocking slightly on his heels like he used to when he was nervous before a school presentation. Ashley was beside him, arms folded, her expression carefully composed. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a brief moment in the quiet before stepping out. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes as I walked toward them. "Mom," Daniel said, offering a quick hug that felt more like a formality than comfort. Ashley kissed the air near my cheek. "We hope we are not interrupting anything," she said smoothly. "Not at all," I replied, unlocking the front door. Inside, the familiar scent of lemon cleaner and old books wrapped around us. I gestured toward the living room where my husband's leather chair still sat by the window. Daniel glanced at it, then away. We sat down, the 3 of us forming a small triangle of polite distance. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. Whatever they had come to say, I already understood one thing clearly. They believed I needed something from them. And they had no idea how wrong they were. Daniel cleared his throat and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees the way he used to when he was about to ask for something as a teenager. Ashley sat upright beside him, her back perfectly straight, her hands folded neatly over her purse as if this were a business meeting rather than a visit to her mother-in-law's home. The lamplight cast a warm circle over the coffee table, glinting faintly off the framed photographs of birthdays and graduations that lined the bookshelf behind them. For a moment no one spoke. I listened to the soft ticking of the wall clock and the distant hum of a passing car outside, allowing the silence to stretch until Daniel finally filled it. "Mom, things have been a little tight lately," he began carefully. He did not look at me when he said it. He looked at the edge of the rug, tracing an invisible line with the tip of his shoe. Ashley nodded in agreement, her expression composed but alert. The market has been unpredictable, she added smoothly. A few clients pulled back on contracts. It is temporary, of course. I folded my hands in my lap and tilted my head slightly. I am sorry to hear that, I said, my voice even. Daniel exhaled as if he had been holding his breath. We are not in trouble, he continued quickly. It is just that cash flow is slower than expected. We have some opportunities coming up, but we need a bridge to get through the next few months. There it was. Not desperation. Not yet. Just a carefully worded explanation. Ashley leaned forward now, her eyes fixed on mine. We were actually thinking, she said, her tone measured, that maybe it would make sense for you to consider selling this house. It is a lot for one person, and property values are high right now. If you moved into something smaller, you could invest the difference. Or even stay with us for a while. I glanced around the room, at the faded floral curtains I had sewn myself 20 years ago, at the oak bookshelf my husband built in the garage one winter when money was tight but time was plentiful. The house was modest, just under 1,800 square feet, but every corner held a memory carefully earned. I managed just fine, I replied gently. Daniel rubbed his hands together. We know you do, Mom. You have always managed. But maybe it is time to make things easier on yourself. You are still working 2 jobs. Ashley offered a sympathetic smile that did not quite reach her eyes. It must be exhausting. I let her words settle without arguing. Exhaustion was not what I felt. Purpose was. Stability was. I rose slowly and walked toward the kitchen. Would you like coffee? I asked. Daniel nodded gratefully. Ashley declined, choosing instead to scroll briefly through her phone before slipping it back into her purse. As the coffee brewed, I stared at the small calendar pinned to the refrigerator. I had circled several dates in red ink earlier that week, including the dividend payout. Scheduled for Friday and the quarterly review with my financial advisor next Tuesday. I carried 3 mugs back into the living room and set them carefully on coasters. Daniel wrapped his hands around his cup but did not drink. We were hoping, he said quietly, that you might be able to help us. Just short term. Maybe a loan. $25,000 would stabilize everything. The number hung in the air between us, precise and calculated. Ashley watched me closely, as if measuring my reaction. I did not flinch. I did not rush to respond. Instead, I took a small sip of coffee and set the mug down with steady hands. How much did you say? I asked calmly. Daniel repeated the amount, his voice softer now. I met his eyes fully for the first time that evening and saw not confidence but uncertainty. They believed they were asking a woman scraping by on hourly wages. They believed I would hesitate, perhaps apologize for not being able to give more. I leaned back against the sofa cushion and considered them both in the warm glow of the lamplight. Let me think about it, I said at last. I will look at my accounts in the morning. Ashley's shoulders relaxed slightly, as though she had already secured what she wanted. Daniel nodded with visible relief. They did not notice the faintest curve of a smile at the corner of my mouth. They assumed my accounts were small, simple, predictable. They had never asked. And I had never told them. After Daniel and Ashley left that night, the house felt larger than usual, as if the walls themselves had leaned back to listen. I stood at the front window and watched their car disappear down the street, the red glow of the brake lights fading into the dark. The air inside was still warm from the coffee, carrying the faint scent of roasted beans and old paper. I locked the door carefully, sliding the deadbolt into place with a soft metallic click, and turned off the porch light. For a long moment I stood in the quiet living room, looking at the indentation Daniel had left on the sofa cushion. $25,000. The number was not large in the context of my life's work, but it was large in theirs. I walked to the small desk tucked into the corner of the dining room and opened the drawer where I kept my leather-bound folder. Inside were neatly organized statements, property deeds, insurance policies, and the updated draft of my will. I carried the folder to the table and sat down beneath the soft glow of the overhead light. Years ago, when my husband was still alive, we had spent many evenings at this same table with a calculator and a legal pad, deciding how much to put toward Daniel's college fund and how much to set aside for emergencies. We had learned early that security did not come from appearances. It came from discipline. I ran my fingers over the duplex deed, remembering the day I signed the paperwork. The real estate agent had looked surprised that a middle-aged couple with modest incomes wanted to buy an investment property. "It is a risk," she had warned gently. We had nodded. We understood risk. We also understood patience. I opened my laptop again and logged into each account one by one. Brokerage. Retirement. Rental income. The numbers aligned exactly as I expected. The total net worth column sat quietly above $2,300,000. I did not feel excitement. I felt clarity. I thought about Ashley's suggestion that I sell this house, that I move into something smaller or perhaps into their guest room. I pictured my boxes stacked neatly in someone else's garage, my routines adjusted to fit another household's preferences. I closed the laptop slowly. That would not happen. The following morning I rose at 4:30 as usual and dressed for my shift. The sky was still dark when I stepped outside, dew clinging to the grass and the air cool against my cheeks. As I drove to the supermarket, I considered what help truly meant. A loan could solve a temporary problem. It could also create a permanent expectation. Daniel had not asked about my savings. He had assumed there were none. Ashley had not asked whether I was comfortable. She had assumed I was vulnerable. I parked in the employee lot and sat for a moment before going inside, watching the first streaks of sunrise stretch across the horizon. I had worked for everything I owned. Not out of desperation, but out of choice. At the store I stocked cereal boxes in straight, even rows, aligning the labels carefully. My manager thanked me for picking up an extra shift later in the week, and I agreed without hesitation. The steady rhythm of lifting and placing calmed my thoughts. I did not resent Daniel for asking. I resented the assumption behind the request. That afternoon, during my lunch break, I called my financial advisor and scheduled an appointment to review liquidity options. I wanted facts, not emotion, guiding my next step. When I returned home that evening, I placed the folder back in its drawer and brewed a fresh pot of coffee. I would invite them back tomorrow, I decided. Not to argue. Not to defend myself. Simply to show them something they had never bothered to see. The truth was not loud. It did not require raised voices. It only required numbers, printed clearly in black ink, laid flat on the table between us. The next evening I called Daniel and asked him to come by again after dinner, telling him I had looked over my accounts and wanted to talk in person. He agreed quickly, his voice carrying a hopeful edge that had not been there the night before. Ashley arrived with him, dressed in a soft beige sweater and tailored slacks, her expression attentive but confident, as if she already believed the outcome had been decided. I had set the dining table neatly, not for a meal but for clarity. 3 chairs. 3 glasses of water. A single folder resting in the center, closed and aligned with the edge of the wood. The overhead light cast a steady glow, eliminating shadows. Daniel glanced at the folder as he sat down. "You did not have to make this formal, Mom," he said with a small, uneasy laugh. I folded my hands calmly on the table. "It is not formal," I replied. "It is organized." Ashley leaned slightly forward. "We really appreciate you even considering this," she said smoothly. "We know it is not easy." I nodded once, then opened the folder. Inside were printed statements from each of my accounts, neatly tabbed. I slid the first page toward Daniel without commentary. He looked down, his brow furrowing as his eyes scanned the numbers. The silence lengthened. Ashley leaned closer, her posture tightening as she tried to follow the columns. "This is your retirement account?" Daniel asked slowly. "Yes," I answered. "And the next page is the brokerage account. The duplex. Rental income summary is behind it." I did not rush. I did not emphasize any figure. I simply allowed them to read. The total asset summary page rested at the bottom of the stack. When Daniel finally reached it, his hand paused. He read the number once. Then again. $2,312,486.72. His breath shifted, barely audible but unmistakable. Ashley's composure faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered it. "I did not realize," she began carefully, "that you were invested like this." I met her gaze evenly. "You did not ask." Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "Mom, why are you still working?" he asked quietly, confusion replacing confidence. I considered the question without offense. "Because I choose to," I replied. "I like earning my own income. I like structure. I like knowing that every dollar I spend is supported by my effort, not by obligation." Ashley folded her hands tightly together. "Then you can help us," she said, the words coming faster now. "This would not even make a dent for you." I rested my palms flat on the table. "It would not make a dent in the total," I agreed calmly. "But it would change something else." Daniel looked up. "What do you mean?" I closed the folder gently and aligned the papers. "If I write you a check for $25,000, it will not be about support. It will be about expectation. Next time there is a shortfall, you will look here first. And eventually, I will not be seen as your mother. I will be seen as your solution." The room grew still. Ashley opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. Daniel's eyes dropped to the table. I softened my tone slightly. "I raised you to build your own stability," I said. "Not to depend on mine." Daniel swallowed and nodded faintly. The confidence he had carried into the room had thinned into something quieter, something more reflective. I stood and gathered the folder, returning it to the sideboard. "I am not struggling," I continued evenly. "I am not tired. And I am not planning to sell this house." Ashley's posture shifted, less certain now. Daniel looked at me with a mixture of surprise and something close to respect. The assumption that had brought them here had dissolved, replaced by a new understanding they had not anticipated. I had never needed rescuing. And I had never been small. Daniel did not speak for several seconds after I returned the folder to the sideboard. The weight of what he had seen seemed to press against him, reshaping something that had been quietly assumed for years. Ashley rose first, smoothing her sweater as though adjusting the moment back into something manageable. "We did not mean to offend you," she said carefully. "We were just trying to think practically." I nodded once. "Practicality is important," I replied. "But so is understanding the full picture." Daniel stood and walked slowly toward the window, looking out at the small front yard where the maple tree stretched its branches toward the dark sky. "I thought you were overworking yourself because you had no choice," he admitted quietly. "I did not realize you were comfortable." I let the word sit in the room. Comfortable was not the word I would have chosen. Prepared was closer. Disciplined was closer. "I have never worked because I was desperate," I said evenly. "I worked because I refused to be dependent." Ashley's posture shifted again, this time less defensive and more uncertain. "You could retire tomorrow," she said, almost to herself. "Yes," I answered. "I could." Daniel turned back toward me. "Then why not?" he asked. There was no accusation in his voice now. Only confusion. I considered him carefully, seeing not the grown businessman but the boy who once lined up toy cars across the living room floor. Because working keeps me sharp, I said. It keeps me engaged. It reminds me that my value is not measured by what someone else gives me. The room was quiet again, but it was no longer tense. It felt reflective. Ashley sat back down slowly. We made assumptions, she admitted, her voice lower than before. I did not contradict her. Daniel exhaled and nodded. I am sorry, he said, the words coming without hesitation this time. I should have asked instead of assuming. I studied his face for a long moment and saw sincerity there. It is not about the money, I told him. It is about respect. When you laughed about my jobs, you were not laughing at the hours. You were laughing at the idea that I might be struggling. Ashley looked down at her hands. I did not think it mattered, she said softly. I thought it was harmless. I folded my hands together calmly. Nothing is harmless when it chips away at dignity, I replied. The statement hung in the air, not harsh but firm. Daniel walked back to the table and placed his palms against the wood. We will figure this out ourselves, he said. We do not need a loan. I inclined my head slightly. I believe you will. Ashley glanced at him, then at me, and something in her expression shifted from calculation to reconsideration. The balance of the room had changed. Not through raised voices or dramatic gestures, but through clarity. I walked them to the door a few minutes later. The porch light cast a soft glow over the steps as they descended. Daniel paused before getting into the car. Mom, he said, meeting my eyes directly for the first time in a long while, I am proud of you. The words were simple, but they carried weight. I offered a small smile. You always should have been, I replied gently. As their car pulled away, I did not feel victorious. I felt steady. Inside, I returned to the quiet living room and sat in my husband's old leather chair. The house felt the same as it always had, grounded and secure. I would go to work in the morning as planned. I would stock shelves and balance accounts. Not because I had to. Because I chose to. And that choice, more than any number printed in black ink, was what defined me. The following week unfolded with a quiet shift in the air between us. Daniel called more often, not to ask for anything, but to check in. The first time, he asked about my shift at the supermarket, and he listened when I described reorganizing the seasonal aisle and training a new employee who reminded me of him at 21, eager but uncertain. There was a pause at the end of that call, and then he said, I never really thought about how much you enjoy it. I smiled into the phone even though he could not see it. Most people do not, I replied. At the auto repair shop, I balanced invoices beneath the steady hum of fluorescent lights, running columns of numbers with practiced precision. I found comfort in the predictability of it. Outside those walls, markets fluctuated and businesses rose and fell, but here, every dollar had a place. A few days later, Daniel stopped by alone in the late afternoon. He stood in the doorway holding a small box of pastries from a bakery down the street. Peace offering, he said with a tentative grin. I let him in and set the box on the counter. We sat at the kitchen table where so many quiet decisions had been made over the years. He looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time, his gaze lingering on the old oak cabinets and the simple tile floor. You built all of this, he said softly. Not just the house. Everything. I poured us both coffee and nodded. Your father and I did, I corrected gently. Daniel leaned back in his chair and folded his arms, not defensively, but thoughtfully. Ashley and I have been talking, he began. We let our lifestyle get ahead of our stability. We assumed growth would just keep coming. I did not interrupt. He continued, when I saw your accounts, it was not just the amount. It was how consistent it was. Decades of consistency. I met his eyes. Consistency is not exciting, I said. But it is powerful. He nodded slowly. I think I confused income with wealth, he admitted. They are not the same. The admission was quiet but sincere. Over the next few weeks, I noticed small changes. Daniel canceled a planned trip and mentioned renegotiating office rent instead. Ashley stopped making remarks about my jobs and once even asked me how I evaluate dividend stocks. Her tone was careful, but it was not mocking. One Sunday afternoon they invited me to dinner. I arrived wearing the same simple cardigan I had worn before, my supermarket name tag tucked into my purse from an earlier shift. This time, when I mentioned I had worked that morning, no one laughed. Ashley asked, "How many hours do you prefer to work each week?" It was a practical question, not a judgment. I answered honestly. "Enough to stay sharp," I said. Daniel smiled faintly. "You have always been sharper than we realized." As I drove home that evening, the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and soft pink. I thought about how easily assumptions form when comfort disguises itself as certainty. They had believed I was clinging to work out of necessity. In truth, I was protecting something far more valuable than money. I was protecting autonomy. Back at my house, I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of lemon cleaner and old books greeting me once again. I placed my purse on the side table and sat for a moment in the quiet. The numbers in my accounts had not changed dramatically in the past few days, but something else had shifted. Respect, once chipped at casually, had been restored not through argument, but through revelation. I would wake again before dawn, lace up my sensible shoes, and go to work. Not to prove anything. Not to impress anyone. But because the choice was mine. And that, more than any balance sheet, was the foundation I had built my life upon. Autumn arrived quietly that year, the maple leaves in my front yard turning a soft amber before drifting onto the lawn in patient spirals. I raked them into neat piles on a Saturday morning before heading to my shift, the cool air crisp against my cheeks and the sky wide and pale above me. Daniel had started coming by on Sunday afternoons, sometimes alone, sometimes with Ashley, and the conversations felt different now. They asked questions instead of offering solutions. They listened without interrupting. One afternoon Daniel stood beside me in the kitchen while I prepared a simple pot roast, the same recipe his father had loved. "I have been reviewing our expenses," he said, his tone thoughtful rather than defensive. "We were spending like growth was guaranteed." I stirred the gravy slowly, watching it thicken. "Nothing is guaranteed," I replied. "Only habits." He nodded, absorbing the simplicity of it. Ashley joined us at the table later with a small notebook in her hand. She had begun tracking their own cash flow, she explained, and wanted my opinion on a few adjustments. There was no edge in her voice, no trace of the earlier condescension. She listened carefully as I described how your lifestyle should always trail your income, not race ahead of it. It was not a lecture. It was a principle I had lived by for decades. At the supermarket, the younger employees began asking me for advice on saving for their first apartments. I showed one of them how to open a simple index fund account and explained the power of compound growth over 20 years. I never mentioned my own numbers. I did not need to. The lesson was never about the total. It was about the process. One evening Daniel called to say they had paid down a portion of their business line of credit. His voice carried quiet pride. "It feels better," he admitted. "Less fragile." I understood that feeling. Fragility does not always show itself until something shakes the surface. Weeks passed, and the memory of that dinner where laughter filled the room began to feel distant, as though it belonged to another season. Respect had returned not in dramatic gestures, but in small consistencies. Ashley no longer referred to my work as exhausting. Instead, she once said, "It must feel good to know you can stop any time you want." I considered her words before answering. "It feels good to know I do not have to stop," I said. "There is a difference." In early November, Daniel invited me to speak briefly at a small workshop he was hosting for young entrepreneurs about financial resilience. I hesitated at first, but he insisted. They need to hear from someone who understands long-term discipline, he said. I stood before a modest group of attentive faces in a rented conference room and spoke about living below your means, about separating ego from income, about building security quietly over decades. I did not mention the duplex or the brokerage accounts. I simply spoke about independence as a form of dignity. Afterward, Daniel thanked me with a sincerity that needed no embellishment. As I drove home that night beneath a clear sky scattered with stars, I felt no triumph. Only steadiness. The house greeted me with its familiar warmth. I hung my coat, set my sensible shoes by the door, and walked into the living room where my husband's leather chair still waited by the window. The numbers in my accounts remained stable, growing slowly as they always had. But more importantly, the atmosphere around me had shifted. Not because they had seen the balance sheet. Because they had finally understood the foundation beneath it. I would rise before dawn again tomorrow, not to prove them wrong, but to continue choosing the life I had built. And that choice, repeated day after day, was the quiet wealth no one could measure. Winter settled in slowly, laying a thin sheet of frost across the lawn each morning that shimmered under the porch light before the sun rose. I continued waking before dawn, pulling on my coat and lacing my sensible shoes with the same steady rhythm I had followed for years. The routine no longer felt like something to defend. It felt like something understood. At the supermarket, the holiday decorations began to fill the aisles, and I helped arrange boxes of ornaments and strings of lights beneath bright signs announcing seasonal sales. Customers rushed past with carts piled high, chasing discounts and deadlines, while I moved at my usual measured pace, aligning products with care. One afternoon Daniel stopped by the store unexpectedly. I noticed him standing at the end of the aisle, watching quietly as I showed a new employee how to rotate inventory so older items were placed in front. When our eyes met, he did not look embarrassed. He looked thoughtful. After my shift, we walked out together into the cold air. I see what you meant, he said softly. About structure. I locked my car and turned to him. Structure builds stability, I replied. Stability builds freedom. He nodded slowly, as though the equation had finally settled into place. At home that evening, I reviewed my accounts as I always did at the end of each month. The numbers had grown modestly again, dividends reinvested automatically, rental income deposited on schedule. Nothing dramatic. Nothing flashy. Just steady progress. I closed the laptop and glanced around the living room. The maple tree outside stood bare now, its branches outlined against the gray sky, patient in its season of rest. A week later Daniel and Ashley invited me over for dinner again. This time, when I mentioned picking up an extra shift during the busy holiday rush, Ashley smiled and said, "You must like staying active." There was no sarcasm in her voice. Only recognition. Daniel added, "You taught me more in the past month than any business seminar ever did." I did not respond with pride or triumph. I simply passed the bowl of vegetables and let the moment rest. As I drove home under a sky dusted with early snow, I reflected on how easily respect can erode when assumptions replace curiosity. They had once measured me by the uniform I wore and the hours I worked. Now they measured me by consistency, by independence, by the quiet discipline they had overlooked. Inside my house, the heater hummed gently as I hung my coat and settled into my husband's leather chair. I looked at the framed photograph on the side table and imagined telling him how things had unfolded. He would have smiled in that calm, steady way of his and said that dignity is not something you demand. It is something you live. I did not need apologies repeated or admiration expressed loudly. I needed understanding. And I had it now. The balance in my accounts would continue to grow slowly over time, but that had never been the true measure of wealth. Wealth was waking up each morning knowing I was not dependent on anyone's approval. Wealth was choosing to work because I valued purpose, not because I feared scarcity. They had laughed once, assuming effort meant desperation. What they saw later was only the surface of something built over decades. What mattered more was what I saw in myself. I had never worked to impress them. I had worked to remain free. And that freedom, steady and quiet, was worth far more than any number printed on a page.